For me, one of the biggest head-scratchers about the antebellum period is the staggering amount of energy, acrimony, and political capital both Northerners and Southerners expended on slavery in the territories. Except for relatively few hardcore abolitionists, just about everybody seemed more agitated about slavery where it didn't exist and was never likely to exist to any great extent than where it did. This is another viewer-generated episode, and there are more in the pipeline, so if you've got ideas for a topic you'd like me to cover, be sure to let me know in the comments. There were 4 major doctrines on how to deal with slavery in the territories in the late 1840s. An entry in President James K. Polk's diary from August 10, 1846, tells us about the first one, which was introduced in the form of an amendment to Polk's requested appropriation of $2 million to acquire title to land from Mexico. Late in the evening of Saturday the 8th, I learned that after an excited debate in the House, a bill passed that body, but with a mischievous and foolish amendment to the effect that no territory which might be acquired by treaty from Mexico should ever be a slaveholding country. What connection slavery had with making peace with Mexico, it is difficult to conceive. This amendment was voted on to the bill by the opponents of the measure, and when voted on, the original friends of the bill voted against it, but it was passed by the Whigs and Northern Democrats who had been opposed to making the appropriation. In this form, it had gone to the Senate. Had there been time, there is but little doubt the Senate would have struck out the slavery proviso and that the House would have concurred. Senator John Davis of Massachusetts, however, resorted to the disreputable expedient of speaking against time and thus prevented the Senate from acting upon it until the hour of adjournment arrived. Had the appropriation been passed, I'm confident I should have made an honorable peace by which we should have acquired California and such other territory as we desired before the end of October. Should the war now be protracted, the responsibility will fall more heavily upon the head of Senator Davis than upon any other man, and he will deserve the execrations of the country. Although it was John Davis who had stalled for time, the mischievous and foolish amendment Polk mentioned was the notorious Wilmot Proviso, introduced by freshman Representative David Wilmot of Pennsylvania, who up to that point had been an ally of the Polk administration. Wilmot explained that while he hadn't objected to annexing Texas as a slave state, since the Republic of Texas had slavery, he couldn't countenance allowing slavery into territory acquired directly from Mexico, which had fully outlawed slavery by 1837. That was the kind of hair-splitting that characterized debates around slavery in the territories. But Wilmot, who sometimes called his amendment the white man's proviso, also offered this explanation: I plead the cause and the rights of white freemen, and I would preserve to free white labor a fair country, a rich inheritance, where the sons of toil of my own race and own color can live without the disgrace which association with Negro slavery brings upon free labor. Enter John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, the lion of state rights, who proffered the 4th doctrine on slavery in the territories, which we'll get to a little later. Whipping up Southern agitation over the Wilmot Proviso, he wrote, "We ought, rather than to yield an inch, take any alternative, even if it should be disunion." In the words of historian Clement Eaton, the territory recently conquered from Mexico, he pointed out, had been purchased by the common blood and the common treasure of both sections. Any discrimination against slaveholders carrying their human property into this region would be a denial to the South of equality in the Union. It made little difference to him or to other Southern extremists that the territorial question was largely an abstraction, since the vast semi-arid regions of the Southwest were not suited to the extension of slavery. Southerners could not submit to such debasement, he declared, without destroying their honor and the spirit of freedom. By the same token, it made little difference to Northerners who pressed the territorial question that they too were demagoguing over an abstraction. So the Wilmot Doctrine was that Congress had the power to regulate slavery in the territories and should use it to exclude the institution. When opponents called him an abolitionist, he pointed out that the wording of the proviso had been lifted from Thomas Jefferson's Northwest Ordinance of 1787. The second doctrine appeared just a few minutes after Wilmot first offered his proviso, when Representative William W. Wick of Indiana proposed extending the Missouri Compromise line westward into the Mexican Cession territory. This proposal gained gained some traction in the years between 1846 to 1850. Polk supported it, and Secretary of State James Buchanan ran on it in his unsuccessful bid for the Democratic presidential nomination in 1848. Congressional Southern Democrats repeatedly voted for it, even as they raised questions about its constitutionality. And as historian David M. Potter wrote, whatever its philosophical defects, the Missouri formula had one ostensible merit that proved more disadvantageous than all its faults. It was free of ambiguity. It spelled out clearly what each side would gain and lose. Thus, it did not offer either side the hope of gaining ground by favorable construction of ambiguous language. The third doctrine, as Potter puts it, possessed all the charms of ambiguity. Popular sovereignty was proposed in 1847 by Senator Lewis Cass of Michigan, the Democratic presidential candidate who lost to Zachary Taylor the following year. Without taking a decisive stand on the question of whether Congress possessed power to regulate slavery in the territories, Cass held that if such power existed, it ought not to be exercised, but that slavery should be left to the control, at a stage not clearly specified, of the territorial government. On its face, this position seemed simple and enticing. By invoking the principle of local self-government, against which no one would argue, it promised to remove a very troublesome question from Congress and to make possible consensus within the badly divided Democratic Party. It seemed impartial in that it challenged both Northern and Southern partisans to accept the verdict of the local majority. But either by contrivance or by chance, the popular sovereignty formula held a deeply hidden and fundamental ambiguity. It did not specify at what stage of their political evolution the people of a territory were entitled to regulate slavery. If they could regulate while still in the territorial stage, then there could be free territories, just as there were free states. But if they could regulate only when framing a constitution to apply for statehood, then slavery would be legal throughout the territorial period, and the effect would be the same as legally opening the territory to slavery. The doctrine of congressional non-intervention, as Cass first formulated it, was more of a device to get the territorial question out of Congress than a solution to place it definitely in the hands of the territorial legislatures. This brings us to Calhoun's doctrine, which was that Congress lacked the power either to exclude slavery from a territory or to grant power to a territorial government to do so. This would mean that the other three doctrines were unconstitutional, and so was the original Missouri Compromise of 1820, which he had supported as a member of President James Monroe's cabinet. Though Calhoun wouldn't live to see it, the Supreme Court adopted his doctrine in somewhat modified form in 1857 in the Dred Scott decision. And as Potter observes, it became one of the cardinal tenets of Southern orthodoxy and operated as one of the key elements of Southern unity in the crises that were to follow. The four doctrines championed by Wilmot, Buchanan, Cass, and Calhoun soon became so many converters to be used by men who needed to discuss the slavery question in terms of something other than slavery. But Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri characterized two of the doctrines in a figure of speech which illuminated their functional reality and their historical importance. Wilmot's doctrine and Calhoun's doctrine, he said, were like the two blades of a pair of shears. Neither blade by itself would cut very effectively, but the two together could sever the bonds of union. People pick the weirdest hills to die on. What do you think of the fact that neither side seemed able to back down in the dispute over an issue of so little consequence in and of itself? I'm loving that some of the videos on this channel are starting to generate discussions in the comments, so please leave your thoughts below while showing more respect for differing views than politicians often did while these issues were heating up in the 19th century. As always, I've got a companion post to this video on my website, so click the link in the description below and help this channel keep growing by smashing that like button and sharing with anyone who might be interested. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.